This week on the show, we're giving you some excerpts from the soft drink cycles, also showing you a little bit about how to use PF against the password gropers on the internet, and telling you the story about the call for testing for the 64-bit inodes. And when we are going to tell you all these great things about BSD? Now. BSD Now, episode 191, recorded on April 26, 2017. Hi, I'm your host, Benedikt Häuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we have, of course, a great show prepared for you today, so we might as well get right into it. So what's the headlines for this week, Alan?
Yes, we got a couple of things, but first, before we get into the news, I wanted to remind people that we have a number of conferences coming up, and the call for papers deadline is this weekend. So you're going to want to get on top of that. So VBSDecon will be in Reston, Virginia, September 8th and 9th. And the deadline to submit a proposal to speak at that conference is April 29th, which is, this Saturday. So you kind of want to get on that. It's easy to do. You just click this Submit a Presentation Proposal button here. It'll take you over to the EasyChair website, which is a conference organizing software. You fill out the little form, tell us what you want to talk about. You know, a couple of short paragraphs is fine. You know, just this much text. Just give us an idea of what you're going to talk about, maybe some bullet points. And the program committee will then pick the talks and come up with a schedule for VBSDecon. So looking forward to seeing that. Hoping for a lot of more user and sysadmin-oriented talks at VBSDecon this year, like previous years. So, you know, you don't have to be a FreeBSD developer or any other BSD to submit to this. Please, if you do anything interesting that other sysadmins and users of all the BSDs would be interested in, please submit something. You know, as I'm on the program committee for this conference, I will be personally insulted if you do not submit something.
Okay. Got the hint. Yeah. And
then also, if you say are from Europe and I don't really want to fly to the States, or, you know, I would rather go somewhere more exotic, then we also have EuroBSDCon 2017, which is in Paris. That'll be September 21st through the 24th in Paris. And it has its call for papers open, and it closes on April 30th, which is Sunday. So you get an extra day. Although, because of time zones, it's not actually a whole day.
Yeah, so get your calls for papers in soon, though. The papers are actually, or could also be tutorials.
Yes. So
if you are interested in giving a tutorial, you could also submit that.
Yeah.
And the conferences are basically 2 weeks away from each other.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm going to both, even though that's slightly crazy. Yeah, so you can submit
one of those.
Yeah, the format for both of the talk types for VBSDecon and Euro is about a 45-minute presentation in English with some time at the end for questions. But for EuroBSDecon, on the 2 days before the conference, the first 2 days of the conference, the 21st and 22nd, there will be developer meetings that are invite only, but there'll also be tutorials. So if you want to teach other users how to do things, whether it's, you know, how to run a BGP router or how to manage all your servers with Ansible or whatever else you want to teach people. I know they've had back at the tutorials, PF, networking, IPv6, all kinds of different stuff. Those half-day tutorials are expected to be about 2.5 to 3 hours, or full-day tutorials, which are 5 to 6 hours. And again, those will be in English. Either way, for those, you can submit by emailing about a 100-word description of what you want to talk about or give a tutorial about, and a short CV or a resume about yourself, and an estimate of your expected travel expenses to get to Paris, because if your talk is accepted, they will be paying those, so they want to know an idea of how much that'll cost. And if you want to submit more than one idea, because, you know, if you have 2 or 3 ideas and you don't know which one they're going to prefer, please submit each one as a separate email to submissions@eurobsdcon.org. So links in the show notes. But yes, look forward to seeing a record number of people at both conferences. So please come out. And, if you have something interesting to talk about, please also submit and so that we can have the most interesting schedule of talks possible.
Yeah. And we might even catch you at the conference to get an interview from you about the stuff that you are doing or talking about.
Yep.
Okay.
So, on to the news.
These are the 2 conferences you should submit to. And the very first item we have this week is from TrueOS. So there's a developer commentary, philosophy, evolution of TrueOS / Lumina and other thoughts. So what this is about is basically it's from Ken Moore, the Lumina developer. And they apparently took a discourse to answer a few questions about the development philosophy for TrueOS and Lumina and provide some insights why these projects have evolved the way they did. And that's based on a forum entry or forum questions thread, I think.
Yep.
And it's basically the blog post distilled those into a more comprehensive paper with the questions and answers that were discussed there. So to start off with the headline is basically a philosophy of development, and the subheadline, the first one is no project is an island. So what's this is about, Alan?
It says, every single project needs or uses some other external library, utility, communication format, standards, or something in order to be useful. This is especially true for graphical applications, since they need to utilize the current stuff, like a display system like X11, or maybe in the future something like Wayland, the audio system, whether that's OSS, ALSA, Pulse, SNDIO, or whatever, and more. And so, when you're building something, sometimes you're partly constrained by the libraries and tools that you have to work with to build things.
Yeah, and the stuff you get from upstream other projects that you're either getting directly your code from or your applications, or just a library or something that integrates in your project.
Yeah,
so that's the island philosophy.
Another point about that coming up. So the other things it says is a static project is typically a dead project. A project needs regular upkeep and maintenance to ensure it continues to build and run on the current ecosystem of libraries and utilities, even if the project has no considerable changes to the code base or feature set. The ecosystem is a constantly moving target. If a project stops the upkeep, the passage of time increases the odds that the project ceases to build and run. So because you depend on all these upstream things, and eventually, they make changes and improvements, and in generally, eventually, a non-backwards compatible way, eventually your application has to catch up to those, otherwise it won't work anymore. And so that's where this next point comes from, where upstream decisions can have drastic consequences on your project. Through no fault of yours, your project has been rendered obsolete or broken by changing standards in the global ecosystem that affects the project's dependencies. For example, look at the audio subsystem wars between ALSA and Pulse Audio, or the fight that people are more familiar with, where ALSA lost. But do you remember when Jack was a separate audio system? Jack was soundly beaten by ALSA, even though Jack was or is better at low latency functionality. However, Jack losing to ALSA means nearly all developments and support for Jack has since disappeared. So if you built your app based on that, it's just gone now. Furthermore, all these audio recording mixing utilities that use Jack in order to present controls to the user are pretty much unusable now because of this upstream decision to switch everything to Pulse Audio.
Yeah, that can be a problem.
Yeah, and because so much of the development time, interest, and possibly money that gets poured in some of these upstream projects is dictated by unrelated projects. It's like, whatever one Ubuntu picks ends up being the one that gets all the work done on it. Can mean that that has quite an effect on our BSD desktops trying to consume this stuff, even though the decision had nothing to do with BSD at all. But also means that if they, as the trend becomes them focusing more and more on building it just good enough for Linux and not as a general, more portable application means that we have more of these problems.
Right.
So
in this case, we are also basically a consumer of upstream of an upstream consumer, so a consumer of a consumer, basically.
Yeah. So Ken points out that the operating system focus is the key here. So what OS is the project originally designed for? This defines how upstream dependencies lists appear and which heartbeat you need to monitor. For Linux-based utilities like Ocular or Firefox, this means the only supported audio subsystem is now Pulse Audio, even though we still have OSS on FreeBSD and it works a lot better. Because OSS has gone away on Linux, it's gone away in Firefox. Or even if it hadn't, it was not going to get the maintenance and support it was going to need, and it was eventually going to break anyway. So even while it still worked, we kind of needed to be working towards supporting Pulse Audio because that's what you need in order to have it work in Firefox. Because now Pulse Audio is the only audio system officially supported on Linux, and all your app's primary development platform is Linux, so that's what you're going to have to support. For FreeBSD and TrueOS, this presents a massive challenge to continue to support things like Firefox, as these applications are now essentially incompatible with the native subsystems used on our OS. While not impossible to support, it takes a lot of time and effort to port these applications over so they actually run properly on BSD, often introducing new bugs and other usability issues along the way. And so that's why a lot of these decisions that are being made. It's not because the TrueOS developers decided that was the best thing to do. It's because their hand was pretty much forced by what they have to work with.
Yeah, and it can be a major issue like switching these different systems just because you ended up on the wrong side of the development tree and found your way that this system that you supported previously is not the one that's popular anymore. So you have to basically rip out the old parts and put in the new stuff.
Yep.
While at the same time, remaining stable and get the features out to your users that they are used to.
Mm-hmm. So it says, looking at PCBSD and TrueOS, it says PCBSD was largely designed around KDE and FreeBSD, but now KDE has moved on to KDE/Plasma 5, which is available on Linux for over a year now, but it's still not generally available on FreeBSD. There is a version tucked away in the Area 51 repo where it's being worked on, but it's not ready yet. And so that left TrueOS in the position of, well, we can keep shipping an old version of KDE, or we're going to need to solve this problem. And that's kind of where Lumina came in. They say, what about KDE 4 on FreeBSD? This runs into the problem with static projects discussed above. KDE 4 is basically a dead project now. All the effort is on KDE 5. This means it's continuing to accumulate security vulnerabilities like HALDI, OS incompatibilities, and is relying on other dead or dying projects for critical functionality like PolicyKit and ConsoleKit, both of which have been replaced by systemd on Linux. Posing a different problem when, ConsoleKit and PolicyKit could be ported to FreeBSD. Systemd, not so much, leaving us in the position of how do we solve that problem. For PCBSD 10, we tried to mitigate a lot of the changes in KDE by making our OS configuration utilities desktop environment agnostic, allowing us to replace the default stuff in KDE with PCBSD specific ones so that you could keep using it. But that only gave us a short reprieve from the underlying decay of KDE just, rotting because nobody's working on it anymore. It also introduced a split brain framework where our functionality and supported tools were available simultaneously with other, whether it's KDE or what other DE you're using, you end up having that tool which, you're used to using on Linux or that the tutorial says to use, and it doesn't actually work. And then there is a PCBSD specific tool that does work, but you have to go and find it and so on. Or one of them only kind of works, and then you end up in this split brain situation. So they created Lumina. As a developer of PCBSD for a long time and a tester for since nearly the beginning of the project, he was keenly aware of the winds of change that were blowing in the open source ecosystem. This was especially true in the desktop environment subsystem long before systemd was even announced. Because of this, Ken started working on a FreeBSD-based desktop environment that did not rely on all of these Linux-only subsystems and frameworks. This was so we could ensure that FreeBSD-based desktops could outlast other Linux-based desktops that were going to keep becoming more and more incompatible with BSD.
Yep, and that took a major effort, I think, and it's still ongoing. But I think Lumina is shaping up nicely, despite or probably due to these reasons that they don't, rely too much on these upstream things.
Yeah, it allows them to not have their pace and where they spend their time dictated by, oh, the audio subsystem is changing again, or oh, you need to now replace whatever policy kit did, and so on. So all of these ecosystem changes finally came to a head in the beginning of 2016. KDE 4 was starting to deteriorate underneath us. The FreeBSD release branch would never allow us to compete with the rate of new graphics drivers and new Wi-Fi drivers that were coming out. In response, we started rolling monthly snapshots of PCBSD based on FreeBSD's current branch, which at the time was preparing to become FreeBSD 11. Surprisingly, this rolling release model of monthly snapshots solved a lot of the long-standing issues with PCBSD. It meant that new drivers showed up very quickly. Bugs fixes were available almost immediately rather than waiting for the next release and so on. And critically, the project now has become a single supported version, which makes it much easier for their developer hours instead of having, PCBSD 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, etc. At the same time, we started switching to using Lumina by default instead of KDE. During the switch, we discovered much of what we were working on started clicking together. The interface was stable. There was a single set of OS configuration utilities. A number of upstream bugs from Linux affecting dropped a lot because you're using a lot less Linux-specific stuff. As Lumina is finishes KDE? Definitely not. However, most of the critical issues are solved now and are, solved permanently, meaning that they won't just happen again like when we keep trying to fix KDE to keep it working as more and more bits of it fall apart. Those fixes can't really be permanent, whereas fixing stuff in Lumina pretty much is.
Right. And you also have to convince your users that this is the right path to go with. I mean, if no one would use Lumina, they would still demand KDE working. It would be difficult for the project to continue in that way.
Yep. So then they get into the rationale behind why they changed the name from PCBSD to TrueOS, part of it being that there wasn't necessarily a clear upgrade path between the two, and it just happened. They say, note that this was not a hostile takeover of the PCBSD project by rabid FreeBSD fanatics. This was more of a refocus of the PCBSD project onto something that could actually survive long term. Yes, TrueOS has bugs and issues, and some of it is those crop up sooner. Or, generally what had happened in FreeBSD before is the new bugs went into the current branch, and then hopefully were fixed before the next release. Now TrueOS is writing that current branch and finding the bugs sooner. While that is, it is a little painful as the user, it does mean that those bugs are actually getting fixed though. Whereas, if not enough people are using the current branch, then they end up escaping into a release, and that's a much worse scenario. As long as we can keep the rate of disruption to your desktop low enough that you can tolerate it, it's not so bad. Plus, with the advent of ZFS boot environments, if the upgrade does go badly, you can, with just a quick reboot, go back to what it was the previous snapshot, and everything works again.
Yeah, which is a major thing for people who also want to try out new things and still want to be able to, get back to a stable and working version sometime when the update doesn't go as well as they thought.
Yeah. So this is what you're seeing is also how much churn happens in an open source ecosystem at any given time. Although I personally think the churn is a bit more aggressive currently because the changeover to a rolling model is still fairly fresh and the developers and contributors are still adjusting to the new realities of that. But they're working on making that be a little less disruptive. There's just a lot of stuff happening right now, especially TrueOS has been relatively aggressive at adopting new technologies. So they have quite a few different new bits going on at once. And that's, obviously increases the chance of things exploding spectacularly.
Yeah, and especially when you're working on multiple things at the same time, there's always a chance that the other one either interferes with the other one, or that a single thing that breaks in one subsystem interferes with the whole desktop experience that people are having.
Yep. So then one of the remaining questions was, why so many little utilities in Lumina? And well, there's a few reasons for these. The big one is, if the functionality isn't available in TrueOS, we want a utility for that. Sometimes we can't find an open source application to add to the TrueOS base install, which fits our criteria. Or, if it's relatively Linux specific, it's better to have our own tool because that Linux one's going to break eventually. And we'd rather not have to write it in a rush, right?
Yeah. With the right
and then sometimes the other ones is the Insight file manager, Lumina FM, and the Lumina archiver are good examples because they can do better things because they know they're running on TrueOS. The Insight file manager isn't just a regular file manager. It knows you're going to be running on ZFS and can take advantage of that and provide a lot more functionality that a regular file manager wouldn't have because it wasn't designed to run on ZFS.
Yeah, they added those specific bits to their file manager to get that for their, because that distinguishes from the just upstream project. They have their own file manager with the BSD or the ZFS bits in this case.
Yeah, and as a part of it is about future-proofing TrueOS. Sometimes the utilities you've been using for a long time start losing functionality or changing out from under you. And I say this is mostly because of, the upstream project starts expecting more dependencies that are unavailable or just too much work to have on FreeBSD. So Ocular, the PDF viewer, has been replaced with Lumina PDF, which has the most important feature, which is display the PDFs on the projector full screen while letting me see my notes on my laptop screen, which is the only thing I care about in a PDF viewer.
Simple functionality, but incredibly difficult in some PDF viewers.
Yes.
The implementation, sometimes it's totally crazy, or it needs a lot more settings to get it right.
Yeah.
And Lumina PDF basically does that.
So, this goes on and on about much more stuff, but they talk about their stance on external applications. It says, where TrueOS is concerned, it's not our responsibility to ensure the availability or functionality of Linux-based applications. This is more the responsibility of the FreeBSD community and the ports committers. What we focus on is the reliability, stability, and dependencies of the base applications that TrueOS ships with. So, FreeBSD has what's in its base, which is what actually lives in the FreeBSD source repository. TrueOS expands on that by having a bunch more of stuff included, which provides you a better out-of-the-box experience. And they take care of all that. But the third-party applications, again, they're just borrowing the ports tree from FreeBSD. And so, they can't do it all. They're not that big of a team. But it means that, they make sure that you have a file manager and you can browse and open your files with a GUI, that you have a terminal so that you can access the command line. You have a web browser that works. You have an email client that works, whether you've, like a command line client like Mutt, or if you want Thunderbird, but that works. You have a PDF viewer, you have a text editor, both graphical and CLI, and you have a media player. So, you can download, view, and print documents, you can give presentations, and you can watch videos. That's the important thing. There are quite a few other use cases and file types, and some of those stuff you'll need to get externally, but they say, currently the desktop functionality, they would like to look at things like, is it possible to log in with an arbitrary user account via, say, Active Directory or LDAP and so on? Can the user launch and manage their applications easily? Are system notifications and status easily visible, like your network connections and your battery status and so on? And does TrueOS and Lumina run on low-end systems or systems without a GPU? Or without an accelerated GPU?
Yeah, so these are the considerations for a desktop distribution, basically, or desktop development project like TrueOS and Lumina.
Yep, there's quite a bit there. So if that didn't seem overly technical, then you should wait and see the next thing.
Yeah.
Yes. So based on the blog post we talked about 2 weeks ago called Turtles on the Wire, which explained all the craziness that happens inside your network card to actually let you send and receive traffic in the modern days. The same author, Robert Mustache, is back with a video from Joyent's new series of lunchtime technical discussions that they'll be recording and posting. As they started expanding their team, they want to get everybody up to speed. They have some of their subject matter experts giving little talks. So Robert has this one called Excerpts from the Softring cycle. So this is the software side of Turtles on the Wire, basically, starting with the MAC layer when the NIC says, hey, I have a packet for you, up through when it goes into your application, how all that works.
Yeah, the full stack, basically, how it traverses these different parts of the operating system.
Yeah, so the video focuses on the network stack and the software, how it works, and how it relates to virtualization and multi-tenancy. So they talk about virtualization and zones as well, which is zones are these IllumOS version of jails. So it talks about how the network stack in IllumOS works when you have virtual tenants, whether those are VMs or zones, and how restrictions are placed on those too, right? So it describes the many layers of the network stack, how they work together, how they can be made to work quickly. It talks a bit about the trade-offs between high throughput and low latency. There's a lot of technologies network cards have now, like TSO for TCP segmentation offloading and LRO for large receive offloading and RSS and all this stuff. Some of them have a cost, right? There's some talk about polling later and so on. So we can reduce the cost of doing a lot of bandwidth by batching things up. But the problem is when you wait for an entire batch before you do the work, that means the first guy in the batch has to sit around waiting for a while, which increases the latency. So it depends if your goal is to be able to push, 10 or 40 gigabits across the wire, or if your goal is to have every packet processed within a small amount of time. And usually what you actually want is some middle ground where you want no worse than this much latency, but as fast as possible.
Right, yeah.
Or as much data being moved as possible. Yeah. It talks about that a little bit. It gets into how security is enforced. So, say a virtual tenant can't create a packet to be sent on a VLAN that they're not supposed to have access to. So they can't, inject a packet into some other virtual tenant's VLAN. And also to make sure that they can't receive a packet from a VLAN that they're not supposed to be part of.
Yeah, well isolated.
Yeah, all the code that goes in there to make sure that, only the right packets go into a tenant and that, only the packets that are expected can come out of the tenant. And then they talk about how incoming packets are filtered and classified and eventually delivered to the intended destination. So how you can, give the list of MAC addresses we care about to the NIC until, eventually you might have so many virtual tenants that the NIC doesn't have enough room, so you have to switch it to promiscuous mode and then do some of the filtering in software. And then what that means for performance and just how packets actually get from the NIC to the right VM or zone. It also gets into how the system decides if it has enough available resources to actually process a packet, or if the packet needs to be dropped or gets dropped because the system can't keep up. And in general, you want to try to avoid that, right?
Yeah, that all that needs to be considered to make the system not only like performant, but also good for the user to use, like interactive enough and all these things.
Yeah. And then they get into talking about how interface polling works on IllumOS, which I kind of assumed would be similar to FreeBSD, but it's actually nothing like the way FreeBSD does it at all.
Oh, it isn't?
Yeah. So with polling in FreeBSD, the way it worked was you would say at your kernel's tick rate, which defaults to 1,000 hertz or 1,000 times a second, so once every millisecond, the kernel would go to the NIC and be like, do you have any packets waiting? So in general, without polling, what normally happens is the NIC raises an interrupt to the CPU every time a packet comes in. But you can imagine if you're getting, say, 500,000 packets a second, you're spending all your time sending interrupts and processing them where, in exchange for a small increase in latency, you could say, instead of sending me 500,000 interrupts every second, how about 1,000 times a second, I come and get the packets that you have for me. And so that's how it worked on FreeBSD. On IllumOS, they actually have a decision tree where we take interrupts normally, but if we start not being able to handle the traffic, it switches to a polling mode, tells the NIC, stop sending me interrupts. I'll call you when I want you. And then trying to process as many packets as it can to keep up. But they use polling reactively instead of proactively.
Oh, okay. So there's a lot of, a little bit more intelligence to it.
Well,
like
yeah, it's mostly you don't get the performance penalty always, only under load, which is an interesting hybridization there.
Okay. Or might be worth discussing this with the FreeBSD.
Well, polling's not really used that much on FreeBSD anymore because most of the newer, faster NICs have what's called AIM, or adaptive interrupt moderation, where the NIC will realize it's sending you too many interrupts, and the NIC will just wait and send them at a maximum of every 1 millisecond or something, or every so many packets, whichever happens first, so that it doesn't flood the processor with interrupts. So I don't know how much of this is actually still needed, or if it would actually make a positive difference or not.
But it's still an interesting, engineering approach, how to get into that problem space and provide a solution.
Yeah, so a lot of this is very specific to IllumOS, but there are usually analogous things on FreeBSD, although it's not necessarily layered exactly the same, and the functions have different names and so on. But it'd be really interesting to see a tutorial of something like this from the FreeBSD networking stack someday. And then the last 20 minutes of this talks are spent on how QEMU, which is the interface for their KVM hypervisor that they ported to IllumOS, actually interfaces with the network stack and how it does stuff. They also talk a little bit about how currently VLANs are very poor performing on IllumOS because they have some fast paths for TCP4 and UDP4, and then they have another tree for other, which is where VLANs, IPv6, and a bunch of other things fall in. And maybe they'd want to make fast paths for VLANs and IPv6 stuff because the performance is not great there for them right now.
Okay, so definitely this is an interesting video to watch for the implementation side, and also how it's implemented in a different system like IllumOS. IllumOS.
Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting thing to listen to, and there's some good whiteboard drawings as well. I don't know the exact schedule for these, but it seems that they are going to stream these live possibly at lunchtimes, and that they have a chat room where they were taking questions from as well. So it might be interesting to find out when these are actually scheduled to happen and how that works.
And we'll keep you posted about future videos that are also covering interesting engineering details for us.
Yep. Do you want to tell us a bit about the next story?
Yeah, so the next one is from Peter Henstein, Mr. Book of PF, called Forcing the Password Gropers Through a Smaller Hole with OpenBSD's PF Queues. So he writes, while he was preparing his material for the upcoming BSDCon PF and networking tutorial, and we have a link to that one in the show notes, he realized that the POP3 gropers were actually not fun to watch anymore. So if you remember, he did that a couple of years ago and blogged extensively about that, how people are trying to abuse POP3 and the system that he manages, and he is averting those with PF rules. So he says he's using traffic shaping features of OpenBSD, of course, to let the miscreants inflict some pain on themselves. But watching the logs became fun again, because there's not also connection established and permission denied and all that, but also it has much more interesting things like feeding that into the PF firewall rules and into filterings and tables. And there's a bit of the discussion going on, apparently. He was basically fishing for suggestions for topics to include in the tutorial and relevant mailing lists. And one suggestion that kept coming up even though it's actually covered in the existing slides, as well as the book of PF, is using traffic shaping features to punish undesirable activity. So there's a tweet from Dan Langell, Mr. BSDCon, about an idea of the PF tutorial throttling of HTTP abusers using PF and Alt-Q. And that basically led him to think about how and whether this is feasible with OpenBSD's PF, and it actually is. And basically that's what the blog post is about. So he writes, regular users will know that Peter is responsible for maintaining a set of mail services, including POP3 service, and that is the site seeing pretty much round-the-clock attempts at logging onto that service and with usernames that are basically spammers most of the time. And he basically describes an approach that you should not let yourself be distracted by this bizarre collection of items that you are maintaining and are describing, that he described in earlier columns. The actual useful parts of this article in this blog post take this as a walkthrough of how to mitigate a wide range of threats and annoyances. He writes, first, you should analyze the behavior that you want to defend against, because that's your overall goal. In our case, that's fairly obvious. We have a service that's getting a volume of unwanted traffic and looking at our logs that attempt some fairly quickly with a number of repeated attempts from each source address. This is similar to both the traditional SSH brute force attacks that he's been blogging about and also what Dan is suggesting in his tweet. And basically, he writes also about how to approach this. Basically, putting those people that are trying to abuse these services, putting those into a brute force table on PF and letting those die in there basically by just delaying their responses in the network. And for the system that runs the POP3 services that he's running, he also has a PF rule set in place with queues for traffic shaping. And for some odd reason, that rule set is fairly close to the AHF-SC traffic shaper in the book of PF. And it contains a queue that he set up mainly as an experiment to annoy spammers. And the queue actually, he posted those as well. So basically, he limits the bandwidth with a maximum throughput of 1 kilobit per second. And this might be a little bit crazy. So this is not your usual traffic shaping rule that you might want to write. But for getting spammers trapped, this is actually an interesting approach.
I've, as a joke, done this to people's IRC connections before. It is quite amusing.
Yeah, I guess you collect a lot of people in that table relatively quickly for those who fall into the trap.
Well, yeah, in this case, they're mostly hammering username and password combinations on the POP3 server based on the knowledge that for most people, it's the same login as it is to send email. So once they've guessed the username and password, they're not after reading what's in your inbox usually. So what they're actually after is then using that username and password to then send mail authenticated as you.
Yeah, which is basically abusing the system and not nice to people, sending as another person. And yeah, he continues on with, now that he has another group of hosts that he wanted to be just a little bit evil to, why not let the password gropers and the spammers share the same small patch of bandwidth? And with a few small additions to the rule sets in his PF rule set that are needed for the good to put the evil to the task, we start basically with a table to hold the addresses we want to mess with. And actually, he just adds two. So one is called long-term and the other one is called pop flooders. And then he goes on to describe what is actually how the rule set will look like. And so he has two rule sets basically. And the last one lets anybody connect to the POP3 service, but any one source address that can have only 5 open simultaneous connections and at a rate of 6 over 3 seconds, which is not very much. But for those people who obey the rules in networking, they don't fall into that rule. But those who abuse it, they pretty much get trapped by that. So any source that trips up one of these restrictions is overloaded into the pop flooders table. And the flush global part means any existing connections that source has are terminated. And when they get to try again, they will instead match the quick rule that assigns the new traffic to the 1 kilobyte queue. So they're already trapped. It's like a network Venus flytrap, basically.
Yeah, or
And the quick rule
Chinese
here,
finger trap or whatever, right? The harder you struggle, the tighter it gets.
yeah, so you cannot escape anymore. The quick rule here has an even stricter limit on the number of allowed simultaneous connections, and this time any breach will lead to membership of the long-term table and the block drop statement or the treatment. So he also goes into monitoring those, like results are immediately visible, monitoring the queues with pfctl VBSDecon shows the tiny queue works as expected. So this one collects a couple of addresses already, and there's a little excerpt from that one. So that mostly says auto logout time elapsed and lists the IP addresses where those people are trying to connect from. So he writes, here the miscreant comes in way too fast and only manages to get 5 connections going before they're shunted to the tiny queue to fight it out with known spammers for a share of bandwidth, which isn't very much bandwidth. And he says, I've been running this with particular setup since Monday evening, around 2000 hours. And by late Wednesday evening, the number of entries in the pop flutters table has reached approximately 300 already. So he now thinks about writing an expiry policy, and he also has an update to that blog post, writing exactly that and explaining that to people as well. So it's not only trapping people, but also letting them get out of it if some person got accidentally caught by that and, has a chance to get out of that as well. But those who still abuse the system will still get trapped.
Yeah. And then in an update at the end, he posted that in the original version of the article, so, if you got on the permanent blacklist, you were there permanently. And he added some stuff to create a cron job to be able to clean that up so that if someone somehow after getting the reprieve, got back on the list eventually and got stuck there, that you would eventually expire those addresses out once they stop abusing.
So this is a nice way of, using your PF firewall to get people or catch the right people, and the abusers can't get much done anymore. So, and it's all done with the PF firewall. So if you are using that, then check out the article and maybe try that in your network or on your hosts and see how many people are abusing your service or your bandwidth, and catch those people and don't allow any further services to those. So yeah, thank you, Peter, for that blog post, and keep us updated if you have more nice little things you can do with PF. And also, if people are interested to hear more about Peter and are going to BSDCon, you should check out his PF and networking tutorial.
So this week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by DigitalOcean, where you can get a FreeBSD-powered server for as little as $5 a month, and you can get it in less than 55 seconds.
Yeah, Jade, spin up the machines called droplets there very quickly in roughly 55 seconds. You basically select an image or an app that you want to run, choose a certain size that you might want to use, and then a region where this droplet should be deployed or running. And that's basically all. Then you can start using that service.
Basically, you can decide, I want the $5 one or the $10 one. I want it in Toronto or Frankfurt. And then I want FreeBSD 10.3 or 11. And I want ZFS or UFS. And then click. And in less than a minute, you can SSH in with your key. And you have a FreeBSD server that you can do whatever you want with. And it includes 1 or 2 terabytes or more of internet traffic at a gigabit. So there's not much you can complain about there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do already with that starting packet, but you can always upgrade if that's still not enough for you. And DigitalOcean will provide you with all the things to manage your little droplet or your droplets if you get multiple ones, like load balancers. They provide also a comprehensive monitoring solution to your droplet, so you can see everything that's happening in those machines.
Yeah, so they have team-based accounts, so you can manage it with a team of multiple people, which I've used very successfully at work. But they also have floating IP addresses. So if you can have the IP address for your website, and then it can move between different VMs. So that could be oh, it's time to upgrade. When FreeBSD 11.1 comes out in a couple of months, maybe instead of trying to upgrade in place on your one VM, you can take a snapshot of that VM, spin up a new one based on that snapshot, upgrade it to 11, and then use the floating IP to move the website to the new one, keeping the old one around for a little bit. Then, once you're happy that the new one's working, you can get rid of the old one. Or if something with your software didn't work right, or you decided you didn't do the upgrade right, you want to try it again, you can just float the IP back to the original droplet and then spin down the old one. It makes it very seamless cool. To be able to switch physical machines. Or you can use the load balancer to only have to run the cheapest droplet when your website's not busy, but be able to spin up a bigger droplet, a copy of that as a bigger droplet to run your website when it's busy, and then you can delete the extra VMs when you don't need them. And with the hourly pricing, it means all you had to do was pay for the hours you needed 2 VMs and not when you didn't.
So it's not a monthly subscription model. You only pay for the amount of traffic that you are actually
so
using.
Basically, you don't pick between monthly and hourly. The pricing is always hourly. It's just capped at these monthly prices. On a month with 31 days, the 0.7 cents an hour of the $5 one might add up to a little bit more than $5. But they kept the price to $5 for you to make so that your bill is even every month instead of being, $5.07 one month and $5.14 another month.
Yeah, up and down.
It makes it easier to budget. So you get nice hourly pricing and a nice round monthly cap on the price. So it's easy for you to tell, if you have a budget, you can easily stay within it, but you can also easily go under it. With it being the 26th of the month right now when we're recording this, if you spin up this $5 droplet, you're only going to pay a couple of cents to keep it running until the end of the month.
Which is enough time to do some experimentation with your favorite BSD. And so check out DigitalOcean and use our coupon code to get started.
When you sign up, use the coupon code FreeBSD now, and it'll add $10 to your account so that you can have lots of fun. So now we have big news in FreeBSD land.
Literally big news. So this is...
Okay, so this is a call for testing from Konstantin Belousov for the new inode 64 branch. So this is upgrading inodes, which are basically the index of the nodes on the hard drive. So it's the file system concept that controls which files you're talking about, basically. So until now, FreeBSD has always had 32-bit values for the inodes, and a lot of applications have depended on that. But the downside of that is, in one file system, you could only have up to 4 billion files, which included NFS. So even though you have ZFS, which can have more than 4 billion files in any one dataset, NFS couldn't actually export more than the first 4 billion. And that really sucked. So they're going to, they've made a branch that's been in progress since, I don't know if I see the date here, but many, many years.
It's been a while.
I think it might have started as far back as 2007. So it might be 10 years of work on this. So part of the problem has been that this will break the ABI. So a lot of applications are not going to expect this change. And so a lot of work has been done to make compatibility shims and so on so that older applications will still work with this. The other advantage to this is that while they're breaking the ABI anyway, they're fixing a whole bunch of other problems.
That are basically coming up.
The biggest one that ZFS lovers will note is that the maximum length of a mount point path will change from, 80 characters or something currently to 1,000. Meaning that you will no longer run into this problem of, the name of your snapshot is too long so you can't mount it. Or the name of this, data set you're trying to create in a jail, or, the sub data set in a jail, the name is too long, so now you have to do silly shortcuts. All of that will go away with this. A bit more here. It says inodes are the data structure responsible for representing objects in the file system, such as files and directories, to applications. FreeBSD has always had 32-bit values for these free inodes, which limits the file system to somewhere under 4 billion objects. Many modern file systems internally use 64-bit identifiers, including UFS, and so FreeBSD now needs to follow suit in Userland so that these applications can use it. The 64-bit inode project, also known as inode64, started life many years ago as a project by Gleb Kurtzu, I think at the time as a Google Summer of Code. After that time, several people have had a hand in updating it and addressing the regressions and fixing stuff. Eventually, Kirk McKusick picked it up, updated the patch, and has acted as the flag waver, coordinating the effort to finally get this finished. So an overview, the inode64 branch extends the basic system types of inode-T and dev-T from 32 bits to 64 bits, and the nlink-T goes from 16 bits to 64 bits. So all the types will now be 64-bit. Motivation is the main risk of the inode64 change is the ABI breakage that's going to cause, and we want to make sure that that's controlled properly. Interesting quirks is we handled KInfo sysctl MIBs, but other MIBs which report structures dependent on the change types are not handled in general. It was considered that the breakage is either in the management interface where rather than in the ABI itself. Anyway, so the testing procedure, if you want to test this, the inode64 project has been tested by cloning the project branch from GitHub or applying the patch from Fabricator, which the URL is in the email there, to a working FreeBSD tree. So what they would like people to test is using a newer kernel, but with the old world. So applications that expect 32-bit, but a kernel that provides 64-bit. They also would like to try the new kernel with the new world, but with old third-party applications. So basically, test each step as you're upgrading, right? So first you install the new kernel and make sure the old world works. Then you install the new world and make sure that your packages still work. Then you can upgrade your packages. They would also like 32-bit compat tests. So booting your machine or a VM in i386, like actually 32-bit mode, and see how it works with 64-bit inodes. Lots of other tests, NFS client and server tests, testing other file systems. This has mostly been tested on UFS and a bit with ZFS, but how does it work if you use other file systems? And the other one is testing the accounting stuff. Disk quotas and all that kind of thing.
And there's also a port status with inode64.
Yes. So Antoine of the port manager ports team on FreeBSD has been running xrun tests, so trying to compile all the applications in the ports tree with this patch. And there's a PR where the results of that can be found. Applications that have problems there, we need to get some patches sorted out for those. Yep. Okay. Other interesting ideas for testing is LLVM includes a component called the address sanitizer, or ASAN, which tries to intercept system calls and using knowledge about the layout of many of the system structures, it tries to figure out, when you're using address space that when you violate what you're supposed to do, right? When you basically do things that when you write to the address space that's outside your space. Since stat and lstat syscalls were removed and several types and structures have changed, it'd be good to reflect that in the ASAN local changes in FreeBSD.
You can already see there's a lot of stuff afflicted by that, if you call it an affliction. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be tested that also interferes. I mean, it's the file system. It also, inodes are everywhere, and everything that's using the file system needs to be tested again.
Yep. In particular, the other problem they're having are GHC, which is a compiler, which is part of the runtime, is written in Haskell, which means you need GHC to compile it. So currently the problem is we have a bootstrap binary of Haskell used to compile GHC, which can then be used to compile Haskell. But the bootstrap binary hasn't been rebuilt with the new 64-bit inodes. and it's kind of a chicken and egg problem there. And then same with Rust. Rust-C is basically similar to GHC and has the same issue. The same solution of patching the bootstrap will have to be done there. So the next steps are, post the wider call for testing, which happened this week, or last week actually. Hopefully to investigate and address failures and that people have, and also dealing with ports that don't break or that do break. Sorry. Then hopefully in May they will be able to request a second exp run, hopefully with all the patches that people have made to the ports, and hopefully the number of issues is way down, and we can once most applications work, we can go ahead with it. And hopefully, as long as nobody finds any showstoppers, on May 19th, this will be committed to FreeBSD head.
Oh, that's quite planned ahead already.
Yes. So hopefully...
There might be some delays depending on what people can come up with. But this is a pretty concrete time schedule, actually.
Yeah. So basically, they have a 1-month testing window. So please test before the 19th of May and report the results so that we can get any problems fixed before this goes into head. And then hopefully it will be a very nice, smooth transition. And we will all have access to more than 4 billion files per file system.
Right. And allow me a little shameless plug at this point. This work is sponsored by the FreeBSD Foundation with the gracious donations we receive. And again, this is the kind of work that takes years sometimes to integrate, and it's difficult for a single person to do that. And there's a lot of more people involved in there, and they're all listed in the email. But basically, donations to the FreeBSD Foundation make this kind of work possible. Okay, off with my Foundation hat again, and back to my BSD Now hat. So, and we're back with the news roundup for this week. So the first one is called Sing Sing BSD, which is kind of an interesting name, but it also involves audio.
Yes. So this one is a FreeBSD Digital Audio Workstation, or DAW for short. It says at this very moment, it's not the most user-friendly, but you'll manage. It's okay. What I want to say is that his work, this person's work on porting some of the audio apps to FreeBSD, met some other people interested in audio porting stuff, and became heavily involved in the drum sampling engine because of this work. So say FreeBSD doesn't have hard real-time support, but it's pretty close. For the needs of audio, FreeBSD's implementation of real-time is sufficient, and in my opinion, superior to the one you get in Linux with the real-time patch, which is pretty ugly and not supported by any distributions and breaks things like VirtualBox. As default, in a default installed FreeBSD, concerned with real-time, all you have to do is tweak a couple of sysutils. In particular, they set the kern.timecounter to .allow deviation to 0. So this stops. So the timers always fire on exact intervals instead of allowing a deviation to save a bit of power and to provide to avoid interrupting things. But if you're trying to do exact digital audio stuff, you need the timing to be exact. So you change that setting.
Real time work.
And then you can set the hardware sound latency to 0. And on USB, set the USB audio buffer to only 2 milliseconds, so that instead of, I think, the default higher value.
Okay.
But they say, so let me get through the list. First one tells FreeBSD how many events it can aggregate or wait for before emitting them. The reason for this is because aggregation events save power, and currently more laptops are running FreeBSD than people are running digital audio workstations, so it makes sense for the default to allow that deviation. Anyway, the second one is the lowest possible buffer for USB audio driver. If you're not using USB audio, then you don't need to bother with that one. The third one has nothing to do with real-time, but dealing with, or the last one there is the core dumps. If you dump core around, you don't need to do that if you're not going to debug this stuff anyway.
Yeah, and then it continues.
Yep, it says
with a couple of
I like to not generate those files by default, but if the apps are constantly crashing, anyway. It says, if you have audio interfaces with more than 8 channels, you need the virtual OSS and virtual OSS CTL modules as well. The decision was made that more than 8 channels of audio are more suitable to be mixed and resampled and generally processed in user space rather than the kernel. He has an RC script for virtual OSS that's still pending, but eventually should go into ports. If you can't find, or if I can't find time to work on it, you can grab a copy there. And just enabling that and play with it. In this case, kind of relating back to what we talked about earlier, because latency is such a concern, he's using the Jack audio server, which is one of the ones that's support is kind of going away for in Linux. But that, backed by FreeBSD's OSS, provides very low latency and good processing. He says, I'm not using real-time for Jack, but it's as it's not supported for non-root processes to raise the priority to real-time. It's like, I thought I recognized this blog. I think this is the guy that made the Mac module to allow you to set real-time priority as a non-root user the other week that we covered.
Right, yeah, that we had. Yeah, so there's a lot going on apparently there. And I like the summary at the end, basically saying that with this setup, he is performing better on FreeBSD than on the original Linux, because there are more audio channels available. So for the audio aficionados out there, you might want to check that out if you're doing a lot of sound and different channel work in that area. So that might be something you might be interested in.
Yeah.
And
so
we'll
creating music on FreeBSD is now easier. Right. Although we don't have songs for every releases like OpenBSD does.
Yeah, we're a little bit different in that. But if you are having already some audio, or doing some audio remixing or something, then you can check out that article to get more into those details.
Yep. So next one we have is a tutorial on setting up an unbound DNS server on FreeBSD 11. In FreeBSD 11, unbound is part of the base system, so it's already installed. You don't even have to do anything. So it says, so why would you run a local DNS server? He says, I'm in a region where internet traffic is still a bit expensive, and it also is pretty slow with really high latencies. To speed that up a little bit, you can run your own DNS server where you'll cache entries and not have to go all the way to your ISP and back just to find out the IP address of something. So they do that because every page that you visit, there will be several hooks into other domains. It's a lot worse now than it used to be. If you go to a website, you're probably going to look up at least 10 or 15 or 20 different domains because of ad networks and plugins and analytics and all this other stuff. And just
coming together.
Third-party CDNs used to host the JavaScript files and so on to try to make them a little faster. And so, caching that stuff can make a big difference.
And he says these will now all be cached locally on our new DNS server if you follow that setup. In his case, I use an old PC Engine Alex board for my home DNS server, but you can use almost anything, the Raspberry Pi, old laptop, or desktops and others, as long as it runs FreeBSD. Yep. And all commands are running as root, of course, and he provides a little bit of network setup or what kind of IP addresses are going to be used in the tutorial. And it starts with some edits in the rc.conf file.
Yep. Basically setting the IP address and net mask, the default gateway, setting up DNS to prefer the local DNS server first and falling back to Google's public DNS, applying those settings, then installing Unbound. The built-in one on FreeBSD is local Unbound, but that's for local only, and we want to provide DNS for the whole LAN. So he installs the full Unbound port, enables that and starts it. And then you see what the basic config that he sets up for it, make changes to the config, restart it, and now you have a DNS server. Stick that in the settings of your DHCP server, and now every machine on your LAN uses it, and you won't end up going out to the internet separately for your 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 different devices. They'll all share the one DNS cache on your DNS server.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward and short enough to understand. And I guess people might want to try that out, even on their laptops, maybe, who are not connected all the time to the network, to do some local caching. Okay, great.
Yes. So our next sponsor is IX Systems. It's like, hey, if you actually need a little low power, quiet Atom machine to run your router and DNS server and maybe an actual caching server and so on, you could get that from IX. Or, if you need something bigger, I needed, a beefier x86 machine with lots of network cards to be my router here, because we have 3 different VLANs and a gigabit of internet. And so I got a nice little low power E3 with 4 gigabit ports, but as a short depth 1U that's not very noisy, and it works great sitting at the top of my rack in my server room downstairs. Or, when you needed something one step bigger than that, it's like, well, I need a 1U server, but I need a special skinny motherboard so I can jam a video card in it as well. And they could do that. And then I was like, well, now what I need is a storage server. So I need to fit as many hard drives as I can in a 2U, but, I'm cheap and I don't want to pay for expensive SAS drives. And so then they built a direct attached storage box for me. And then it's like, well, now I actually have work stuff. And so I kind of want the expensive SAS drives. So I need a 4U that can fit 36 hard drives, and I want them all multipath so that in case one of the controllers goes down or something, my server doesn't go down. And so then they built me that. So they basically built me everything. I've had the entire spectrum from the tiniest, cheapest router I could build to like a monster storage server.
Right, and it grows over the more you use it, the more usage you might find for it. And you might also think about you doing virtualization, and then you need to know, hey, what kind of Intel CPUs are supporting the special VT extensions, for example. And IX System can tell you exactly which CPUs work with that, and also integrate that into your solution.
Right, especially for the first version of the video card based transcoders, we needed a very specific model of their Intel CPU, like a E3 1275 V3. It couldn't be a V4 or a V5 because there wasn't a driver for the offloading the video encoding to the processor for that yet. So it needed to be this very specific model of Intel CPU, but they have the entire selection, so I could get whatever I needed. And they helped me pick sometimes. When I was building the later versions that used a discrete video card instead of the one built into the Intel processor, I was left with the decision, do I get something like an E5 1650, which is a single socket only processor with a lower number of cores but a higher gigahertz per core, or do I get a single 2650, which is a higher number of cores but at a lower number of gigahertz? And it depends on your workload which one of those is best. But if you're not entirely sure, that's where the white glove support and the sales engineers at IX come in. You tell them what you're trying to do, and they'll help you decide which is the best processor. In the end, the 2 different options can end up costing the same, but one of them is going to work better. And that's why it really helps to have someone that knows the difference and knows about these workloads. And unlike your other big vendors, IX actually knows about open source. And that's really going to make a difference for making sure everything works.
Right. And if you're thinking about building a similar system for an open source project, check out ixsystems.com/BSD now, where you can download a ultimate guide for buying a new server for open source, where they give you specific instructions or even questions that you should ask other vendors, whether they could support those. And you should quickly find out whether that other vendor could provide the same service as IX Systems does, which in most cases they don't.
Yeah. So check them out, ixsystems.com, and make sure you tell them that Alan and Benedict sent you. They'll treat you extra special. So the next story we have is an interesting one. This one's a little bit more about programming, but I thought the point was really important to mention. So a group of researchers, mostly from Germany, have found that a lot of online tutorials for web programming, whether those be actual tutorials or question and answer sites like Stack Overflow, often contains serious security flaws. And then they decided to ask the question, does the fact that their tutorials that come up first in Google have security flaws in them actually affect the software people write, since people often use these tutorials to learn how to program? So they used a number of simple Google searches to generate a giant list of tutorials. And then using that, they manually reviewed a bunch of them, audited the code, and found these common vulnerabilities. But then they took that code and put it through an abstract syntax tree, and then crawled GitHub to find projects that might be using that code. So looking for slight variations on basically people copying and pasting the code from these tutorials into their applications when the code from these tutorials has serious errors in it.
Right. I mean, tutorials, if you just want to get something done, the tutorials are good. But if you want to deploy something in production, that's a totally different thing. You need to do more hardening and more thinking about how to deploy that.
You know, if you don't know how to do something, you look it up and you find the answer on the question and answer site, you know, it got copy and pasted. I guess the advantage to the question and answer site is there's the option for people to vote the bad answers down. Whereas when it's a tutorial somebody wrote, there's not necessarily a way for other people to provide feedback that be careful, that tutorial contains a cross-site scripting vulnerability or an SQL injection vulnerability.
Or it's outdated.
So yeah, to quote the abstract here, the web is replete with tutorial-style content on how to accomplish programming tasks. Unfortunately, even top-rated tutorials suffer from severe security vulnerabilities, such as cross-site scripting, SQL injection, or path enumeration, or path traversal. Assuming that these tutorials influence real-world software development, we hypothesize that code snippets from popular tutorials can be used to bootstrap vulnerability discovery at scale. To validate our hypothesis, we proposed a semi-automated approach to finding recurring vulnerabilities starting from a handful of top-ranked tutorials and containing top-ranking tutorials that contain vulnerable code snippets. So they looked at the tutorials, found what are basically the most common mistakes made, then put those through an abstract syntax tree in order to be able to find similar code that's not identical, that you wouldn't just find with like a text search, and then started crawling GitHub to find similar code. We evaluate our approach by performing an analysis of tens of thousands of open source web applications to check if vulnerabilities originating from these tutorials actually recur. They say, our analysis framework has been running on a standard PC and has managed to analyze 64,415 different PHP code bases hosted on GitHub this far, and with that found a total of 117 vulnerabilities that have a strong syntactic similarity to vulnerable code snippets presented in popular online tutorials. So it's not necessarily that it came from the tutorial, but either someone made the exact same mistake or actually copy and pasted the code from the tutorial and maybe modified it for their variables or whatever, but it's the same mistake, basically. In addition to shedding light on the anecdotal belief that programmers reuse web tutorial code in an ad hoc manner, our study finds disconcerting evidence of insufficiently reviewed tutorials compromising the security of other open source projects. Although I don't think it's specific to open source projects at all. It's just to code that's written by people that learn from tutorials. They say, moreover, our findings testify to the feasibility of large-scale vulnerability discovery using poorly written tutorials as a starting point. Is that, you know, we can find these specific types of mistakes or vulnerabilities that are common, and then we can use that to just bulk search GitHub to find other code that is has the same vulnerability. And so it's a new way to maybe discover vulnerabilities in applications. Instead of checking each application for a bunch of these, you know, class break type things, they could actually just look for the most common types of mistakes and then just search all the code for those mistakes using this algorithm they've come up with for not searching for the text string, but actually searching for the meaning of the code.
Yeah, so they described their approach in the paper.
Yeah, so they also broke down the popularity of projects in particular. So of the 64,000 projects they indexed, 42,000 of those are barely known projects or not popular. These are projects that started at least or that were starred at least 3 times and have a total file size of less than 3 megabytes. Then there are projects known by several people, or popular projects, of which there are 16,000 that are started at least 4 times, but at most 9 times, and have a total file size of less than 3 megabytes. And then they have popular projects, or very popular. There's about 6,000 of those that have at least 10 stars. Mm-hmm. And they avoided very large projects, ones that are more than 3 megabytes in size, because they're mostly limited by the GitHub API rate limits. But looking at it, in not popular projects, they found 270 bits of code that seem to be the same as the tutorial, of which 80 contain vulnerabilities, meaning 30% of the code that appears to have come from a tutorial, 30% of it is vulnerable code. So the other 70% is code taken from tutorials that just doesn't happen to have a vulnerability. But they found quite a bit of, just from the small number of tutorials they built their index with, they found lots of copying and pasting, basically. Although for some of it, it's the only-ish way to do it. But with popular projects, they found 528 code analogs with 35 vulnerabilities, meaning a vulnerability rate of about 6.6%. And with very popular, they found 23 vulnerabilities, 23 analogs, but only 2 vulnerabilities, meaning only 8% of the code that was copy and pasted might be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. But they say of all those, 8 vulnerabilities were replicas of code, like literally copy and pasted from the SQL tutorials that we found on the first Google result page of searching for like how to PHP MySQL. One of those, the tutorials on the front page contain some vulnerabilities, and at least 8 of the 117 vulnerabilities they found on GitHub were exact copy and paste of the tutorial code. So
not much effort in there. Mm-hmm. Just first hit on the Google.
They say 80% of the discovered vulnerabilities were SQL injection vulnerabilities, and the rest were cross-site scripting or path traversal. And they have examples of what those code actually look like. And they say in particular, during the manual review, we found a plausible explanation for the disparity in vulnerability density in the moderate and highly popular categories. Code that's written in a more modern way in PHP uses the newer SQL APIs like PDO MySQL or MySQLi, which have specific ways for you to, substitute in the variables and protect you from SQL injection. Whereas people basing it on old tutorials from 15 years ago are doing it the old way and could have this problem. So this is why we don't see the same level of vulnerability in the more popular projects, is because they're mostly being switched to the newer APIs that don't expose the same level of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that this is a problem, or it could be a problem if people are just hunting for a quick solution on the internet and don't think about too much what implications it might have. Yep. Yeah, so this is a nice paper and has a little bit more about, future work and related work in that area. And if you're interested in that, check out that paper. And it's a collaborative paper, I see from the title, from TU Berlin, Saarland University, and the TU Braunschweig. Yep. So there's a lot of collaboration there.
And industry partner was Trend Micro, the antivirus company. So while this particular paper is really about vulnerabilities in code, we can see the same problem with tutorials for sysadmin type stuff as well. Things that recommend chmod 777 without thinking about it and
just make it work somehow.
Yeah. Lots of things of that, or just your curl this URL and pipe it into your shell. It's like
just execute what you downloaded from the internet. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
This is the stuff that keeps me with the newer NoSQL databases. It's like, be careful what you download from the internet. It's not.
Yes. And
checked.
Make sure you put usernames and passwords on things that you expose to the internet. Lots of NoSQL databases out on the internet with no password. Yeah. So
all these systems, they can get a little bit out of hand, and if you don't think about how to secure them and prevent some of these popular overflows or exploits, then a quick fix that you found on the internet could quickly turn into a nightmare if you are not careful with what you are using or what you are trying out from the tutorial.
So it makes writing tutorials a bit harder and keeping them up to date too, because it's not necessarily just vulnerabilities, but you can just because the tutorial is a number of years old, it doesn't necessarily recommend the best way to do it anymore. But if it's the tutorial people find, it's what they're going to do. And then, it gives people a bad taste if it doesn't work or if it is suboptimal in a number of ways. And so it's why it's hard to do things like the FreeBSD handbook, because you have to constantly keep updating it because things change, and you have to be very careful that it's right and is giving people, best practices and so on, and not encouraging bad habits.
Right. Yeah. And the more people check that out and find or notify us of things that they find fishy, then there's a chance that people will check out those and find the errors and correct those tutorials and how-tos.
Yep.
Okay. The next one is a story from the Lumina desktop environment. So there's a development preview with new icon themes. It starts with, as of version 1.30 of the Lumina desktop starts getting closer to release, Ken Moore, who wrote that article, wants to take a couple of weeks and give you all some sneak peeks at some of the changes and updates that he has been working on and in the process of finishing up. And this week's preview covers the new icon theme, which will be distributed or used by default in the upcoming version of Lumina. And there are screenshots, of course, but he writes, the material design, light and dark themes are collections of roughly 800 SVG icons from the Google material design application icon theme, and plus some of the Templarian additions to the material design icon pack. And what we have done is take those two foundational icon packs and just to name the icon files to make them comfortable to the XDG icon naming standards, plus some index files and such for standards compliance. The dark variation is a copy of the light theme, but with the default fill color for the icons switched from black to white for use with darker desktop themes. There are a lot of more icons available in the reference icon packs, which still have not gotten around to renaming yet, but this initial version satisfies all the XDG standards for an icon theme and all the extra icons needed for Lumina and its utilities, plus a large number of additional icons for application use. And he provides some screenshots, which looks kind of nice. If you have seen Lumina before or used it, you might find those icons appealing, either the light ones or the darker ones, depending on your preference. And there's a little bit of an icon show provided here to see what they look like. He also writes, as you can see, this makes a very nice difference in the appearance of the desktop if you happen to like the dark themes as I do. And you can also perform similar adjustments on your system in just a few minutes. This highlights one of the big things that I love about Lumina. It gives you an interface that is custom tailored to your needs and wants, rather than expecting you to change your routines to accommodate how some random developer or designer across the world thinks everybody should use a computer. Yeah, that's true. If you can find a couple of things that you can pick your preferences from, that's very nice, without just getting one standard icon or desktop theme that you have to use, and whether you like it or not.
Yep. So there's a second story here about Lumina's new media player. So it just says, this is a small utility designed to provide the ability for the user to play audio and video files on the local system, as well as stream audio from online sources. For now, only the Pandora Internet radio service is supported via the Piano Bars command line utility, which is an optional runtime dependency. However, we hope to gradually add more streaming services over time. I know this should make a number of people happy, because I know the Pandora Linux client, trying to get that to work on FreeBSD, occupied an entire BSDecon dev summit for me, and I didn't get it working. It says, for a long time I have been using another Pandora streaming client on the TrueOS desktop, but it was very fragile with respect to underlying changes like LibreSSL versions. The player would regularly stop functioning for a few update cycles until a version of LibreSSL, which was compatible with the player, was happened to be the one that was in the base system. After doing this for some time, I was finally frustrated enough to start looking for alternatives when a coworker pointed out Piano Bar, which is also a small client for Pandora's radio. After using Piano Bar for a couple of weeks, I was impressed with how stable it is and how little overhead it required, and as far as extra runtime dependencies. Of course, I started thinking, what if I wrote a nice Qt5 GUI for it? And once I had a few free hours, started working, and now there's a Lumina media player. It started with just an interface for Piano Bar itself, but eventually grew to be a regular video player as well, and a full Pandora client. So,
okay,
cool.
So people can check that out if you want a preview.
And so we're going to quickly end up with a nice little suite of applications to let us do everything with a native BSD app and not be so stuck on whatever the Linux people want to do. This is another reminder to go submit your talk for VBSDecon. Like, literally, pause the video, we'll wait while you go do it. It only takes a minute. You just short explanation of what you want to talk about before Saturday. So just do that right now. Pause the video.
Hurry up.
We'll wait. Okay. Now, go do the same thing for EuroBSDCon.
Yeah, we'll also wait for that one.
It's easy. You just email. All they want is 100 words and then a little bit of information about you and your travel expenses so that they can figure out how...
Yeah, look at the web pages for both of these.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of information that you already want to grasp, and then think about, this could be a nice talk I could give at that conference or at both. So, yeah, why wait? Send your proposal.
Yes. So, on with the Beastie Bits. First news item we have is, as of last Friday, Clang is now in the base system of OpenBSD for AMD64 and i386. So Clang has been added to the base system as a non-default compiler for now on both 32 and 64-bit Intel and AMD platforms. These play along at home or elsewhere. So there's an FAQ that you can follow if you actually want to start trying to compile your OpenBSD system using Clang.
So that's another BSD project. I guess considering or seriously considering the Clang and LLVM.
Right.
Well, you know about
because of the fact that GCC changed to the GPL v3 license, their option was to accept that in their base system, which is really not at all in line with what OpenBSD wants to do, or not support things like ARM64, like the Pine 64, the Raspberry Pi 3, and the Cavium servers.
That would not be good to have for a system.
Those architectures are newer than the version of GCC that is still open source, real open source. And so, there's not really an option other than to move forward at this point.
Right. Yeah, and so the OpenBSD folks are providing a little bit of an FAQ here, how to build the infrastructure and enable Clang if you want to try it out on OpenBSD.
Yeah, basically how to bootstrap Clang and then be able to use it to build your system. There's links in the notes there. The next story we have is a story from a little bit of background from Theo about the fact that there are no CDs for OpenBSD anymore.
Yeah, it's been a while, but these are the last CDs have shipped.
Well, the last ones were for 6.0, and now that 6.1 is out, somebody emailed like, so I sent an email to orders@openbsdstore.com, and they said, I'm like, where can I get my 6.1 CD? And they're like, we aren't making CDs anymore. What are you talking about? So Theo points out how much they tried to push this announcement. It didn't actually, the actual announcement email for 6.1 didn't say that there are no CDs. But the 6.0 announcement said this was the last set of CDs. There was a note about it being the last set for CDs in the actual case liner in the DVD set you bought. It also had 6 songs meant to be an over-the-top celebration, including one of the songs where Theo actually sang goodbye CDs,
lyrics.
I'm done with you. And
it's kind of a subtle hint, but yeah, people should have gotten that.
Yes, he says, I'm sorry for people who missed the cues, but this change is personal. He's done 40 CD releases over the last 20 years, investing a lot of personal effort and risk in building and sustaining the costs for the project and those sub-projects and so on. I don't want to keep making CDs as a way of making a living. The decision was not only economical. I wanted to get rid of the friction of trying to achieve high quality productions for collector item CDs twice a year. 6.0 was a high quality CD release, and he doesn't want to do he'd rather stop there than to start half-assing it, basically, and go out on a not high quality release. They said, having now finished the 6.1 release cycle without having a CD, they've learned that incorporating CDs into the production cycle has been a big drag and basically consumed one of the 6 months out of their 6-month release cycle. Other project developers and processes were locked in that cycle. Now that that's gone, we find that making releases is a lot faster. And they say, generally, our tree is always ready to cut a release. We may be able to actually, in the future, just do a release at the drop of the hat if we need to, not be bound in this kind of more fixed, rigid time schedule because we have to make the CDs and pre-produce them and have all the various bits put together. As long as we produce a release that developers can be proud of, we don't really need CDs.
Right, yeah. And I mean, the old CDs will grow in value as a collector's item over the years, but the shop will not be selling 6.1 or future CDs. Most things come to an end. Sorry, that's what he writes.
And then he says that, if no OpenBSDCs are going to be released, then it's probably best to just send a donation to the OpenBSD Foundation or Theo directly. And Theo says, this is the correct way to sustain software. These CDs haven't pulled in substantial revenue in many years. Based upon income from contributions, the foundation performs a fantastic function, making worries and problems just disappear.
Oh, see, that's a different kind of putting money into the project rather than selling CDs.
So next we have a Dragonfly BSD story. This is as part of a...
So this is about ASLR.
No execute and a bunch of other acronyms, yes. This is as part of a larger discussion about security measures. The NX-bit capability has been added to Dragonfly. You can turn it on and off, and it's off by default, so it doesn't cause any surprises. As the first link in this post points out, your installed third-party software is most of the security issues is more of a security issue than any of the processor features in this case anyway. But there's a whole long discussion about the advantages of things like ASLR, position-independent executables, and the execute disable bit or NX bit. But there's a whole mail thread there if you want to read about it and learn what Matt Dillon thinks of it all.
Okay. That's good to hear something from Dragonfly BSD once in a while.
Next, we have a very interesting story. Over at SSH.com, which is the company that originally made the commercial version of SSH, of which OpenSSH is an alternative, but now they mostly focus on providing tools and compliance stuff and lots of other stuff related around SSH. But they have an interesting history article here from July 1995 and how SSH ended up being port 22. Considering that it was developed so much later than Telnet, which was already port 23, you think it would have had a higher port number rather than a lower one.
Yeah, and everyone assumes SSH is just port 22 by default, and this is the story of why it got that port, or that port number assigned.
And also thanks to SSH.com for being a sponsor of BSDCon's Developer Summit this year. So say yes, the default SSH port is 22, but this is not a coincidence. And here we have the story of how it actually got that port. So Tatu Jolinen wrote the initial version of SSH in spring of 1995 at a time when Telnet and FTP were still widely used. He designated SSH to replace both Telnet and FTP, right, with having SSH and SFTP. And since FTP used ports 20 and 21, and Telnet used port 23, and port 22 was available, it seemed, convenient to just take the number in between the two since it's going to replace the ones on either side. I figured having that port number might be one of those small things that would give some aura of credibility. But how could we get that port number? I had never allocated one, but I knew someone who had allocated a port before. So the basic process of port allocation was fairly simple at the time. The internet was small and we were in a very early stage of the internet. So port numbers were allocated by IANA, the Internet Assigned Number Authority. At the time, that meant that the esteemed internet pioneer named John Postel and Joyce Reynolds, among others, John had been the editor of such minor protocol standards as IP, ICMP, and TCP. Some of you might have heard of, yes. So he said, to me, emailing John felt outright scary, having authored all the main internet RFCs. Anyway, just before announcing SSH 1.0 in July of 1995, he sent an email to IANA saying, Dear sirs, I have written a program to securely log from one machine to another over an insecure network. It provides major improvements in security and functionality over existing telnet and R logging protocols and implementations. In particular, it prevents IP, DNS, and routing spoofing. My plan is to distribute the software freely to the internet and to get it into as wide as use as possible. I'd like to get a registered privileged port number for the software. The number should preferably be in the range of 1 to 255 so that it can be used in the WKS field in name servers. I don't think that exists anymore. I've included the draft RFC for the protocol below. The software has been in local use for several months and is ready for publication. And so on. He says, I'd like to publish the software already this week. I'm currently using port number 22 in the beta software. It would be great if this number could be used as is currently shown unassigned in the list. The service name for the software is SSH for Secure Shell.
That's where the name came from, yeah. And the next day, he had an email from Joyce waiting in his inbox saying, Tattoo, we have assigned port number 22 to SSH with you as the point of contact. Joyce. There we were. SSH port was 22 at that point.
On July 12th, 1995 at 2:32 a.m., of course, he does it in the middle of the night, I announced the final beta version to my beta testers at Helsinki University of Technology. At 5:23 p.m., I announced SSH 1.0.0 packages for my beta testers. Later at 5:51 on July 12th, 1995, I sent an announcement about SSH to the cyberpunks at toad.com mailing list. I also posted to a few newsgroups mailing lists and directly to selected people who had discussed related topics on the internet. By default, the SSH server still runs on port 22. However, there are occasions where it runs on a different port. Testing use is one of those reasons. Running multiple configurations on the same host is another. Rarely, you may be able to run without root privileges, in which case you can run on a non-privileged port, something greater than 1024. The port number can be configured by changing the port 22 directive in your sshd_config, or specifying the -p option on the sshd when you're running it. And then it gets into some of the stuff with firewalls and inbound SSH and how to configure your firewall with IP tables. But interesting story, and slightly less eventful than you might hope. Somehow I think nowadays it would be a bit more to get a new port number assigned.
Yeah, with like, a whole committee deciding. And I maybe it's
the good old days of the
different thing. Or it also involves a lot more money. I don't know. It's probably a lot more difficult nowadays. So this is a nice backstory of how we are now using port 22 and don't think about it too much.
So here we have a Hackers News thread on Netflix serving 90 plus gigabits from a single machine using tuned FreeBSD. The post here impressive. Says, my understanding is that this is just a QSFP28 transceiver using a new optical format. There's been 100 gigabit server NICs for almost 2 years, like the Mellanox ConnectX 4 and 5, using the QSFP28. we've been using them with great success at Netflix in our flash storage appliances. We're able to serve over 90 gigabits per second from a single machine with these NICs using our tuned and enhanced version of FreeBSD and Nginx.
A single machine. A single one.
With only one processor. So it's one socket, not a dual socket machine.
Mm-hmm. This is great. This is really impressive. And I think we're also getting a little bit of an update from Netflix at BSDCon, I think.
Yep.
So that will be an exciting thing to hear. And we also have another story connecting to our last week's segment about compressed ZFS ARC. And we have to thank Josh Petzel for that one, because he moved that from the vendor area into FreeBSD head.
Yes, basically during testing, you found a panic that had been fixed on IllumOS already, but was in a later commit, and so you had to merge that in as well. But with that, we now have the compressed send and receive feature is now in FreeBSD head. And hopefully that means it can be merged back in time to be in FreeBSD 11.1 that will come out this summer. So having those two features in 11.1 will make it a killer release for ZFS. Yeah.
So thanks, Josh, for that one. And people should try it out and report issues they found or whether they like it or not.
And the feedback section of the show today is brought to you by Tarsnap, backups for the truly paranoid. Again, I know it seems like we give the same spiel every week, but if you want to back up your files, which you do, so you don't, it's not a question. Yeah. So you want to back up your files, and you want to do it in such a way that it's secure, so that somebody else can't read your backups, but also in a way that you can be sure that when you're done with that backup and you want it to go away, it definitely actually goes away. If you check out the news recently, you can see that files I deleted from Dropbox 2 years ago are still there. What?
Somehow, this won't happen with Tarsnap. Yes. Or if that would happen, you still cannot read it if you are not the person
You can't guarantee that the cloud is actually going to erase the data. Because the way the cloud works is so replicated and so on, it's entirely possible they don't even know if they've erased all the copies of the data. But if it's encrypted with a key only you have, you can say, all right, I'm going to re-encrypt, I'm going to upload my data again with a different encryption key and get rid of this key. And now that I've destroyed the only copy of it, or the only copies of it, then it's not possible for somebody to decrypt that data. It is gone.
Yeah. And that's why it's Tarsnap and such a interesting solution for people, because they can rest assured that no person other than themselves can access those. And they have some interesting pricing. They also provide the picodollar storage pricing framework.
Importantly, it's pay-as-you-go. So you put in money and then use it up. So there's never a surprise bill. You don't have to worry about that. You can just put in $5 or more, and you'll get an invoice at the end of the month, and you'll get an alert if you're running out of money. But you will never pay more than you expect because you have to pay before you use it. And so because of that, you can't get any surprise storage bills. So it definitely beats most cloud options in that way, because you don't have to worry about, if you use Amazon directly, you're going to get a surprise bill. Something's going to cost more than you thought it was. With Tarsnap, because you put the money in first, you can control how much you spend and know that you're never going to get a surprise bill.
And it's available on virtually any system that you can think of, from the Linux systems to the BSD systems to Mac OS X to even Windows.
If you can use,
there's now the Windows subsystem for Linux, and that works with Tarsnap too.
I think it's the Linux subsystem for Windows, but anyway.
Right, the other way around.
Importantly, if you can use tar, you can use Tarsnap, and if you can use Tarsnap, you should use Tarsnap. So, go back your stuff up. So if you want that, go to tarsnap.com/BSD now. So we have our first question. You want to take that one, Benedict?
So the first one is from Steve, and his question is basically about FreeBSD jobs. So he writes, Dear Alan, Benedict, and JT, I'm a software test and software build automation professional, but I live in a smaller city where all the local employees seem to use Linux or Windows infrastructure. What are your thoughts on ways to find prospective employers who use FreeBSD, but also employ remote workers? Can you suggest things that someone stuck in Linux environments could do to improve their experience with BSD and their appeal to employers using BSD? thanks, guys. Love the show.
Yeah.
There are a couple of options. So first of all, if you're a software and test, software build automation professional, that's already a job that's going to be in high demand or still is. And you just want to ensure that these things that you're currently working, like the tools and the basic software that you're using, is also available on FreeBSD in the latest versions, hopefully, and also that you get experience with the FreeBSD or the BSD specific bits in those, because that makes you valuable for people that are running that in their infrastructure with BSD, so that you can provide the same services for software testing and build automation on the BSDs as well.
Yeah. So for actually finding the jobs, there's the FreeBSD mailing list for that. I know there are often recruiting ads and so on in the FreeBSD journal. They're often at the conferences. A lot of companies that are hiring are around looking for people. Mm-hmm. Lots of FreeBSD jobs are remote friendly because
they're pretty much,
you want the expertise. You take it wherever it lives, not make it come to you, right? For other stuff,
and also
Linux skills are definitely not frowned upon. As long as you have the FreeBSD skills too, then having experience with Linux is only a bonus, not a detractor. And the same goes the other way. Like lots of FreeBSD people I know work at Linux shops. Like some FreeBSD developers work at Red Hat on like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And lots of FreeBSD people are hired at Google to do Linux stuff because FreeBSD people are considered to be, generally very smart. And if you can do it on BSD, you can probably figure out how to make it work on Linux too.
Right. And you could also start a little blog and write a little bit about your experiences, how you use these tools to find certain things in like the software testing and the build automation professional, how you would use it. And start a little blog, and people will, over time recognize that blog, and you can advertise it on social media, of course. And that's where also a lot of recruiters are looking for people to find for their company. So that might be another way of promoting your work that you're doing in that area.
Yeah. Networking is often hard in smaller cities. I definitely know what that's like.
Right. Yeah, and it could also try university contacts. So sometimes professors there have also contacts to companies who are looking for students, and if they cannot find students, then if they have a name or as a person who is interested in that area, they could also make the connection. So there's a couple of different things you would normally not look at, but you could also give a little course at a university, and through that you can find connectivity not only to companies but also the researchers there who might be interested in that, and also trying to promote BSD in that way.
Yep. But for networking, I don't know that there's anything better than a BSD conference. So, whichever is closer for you, of BSDCon, VBSDecon, or EuroBSDCon, means that there's one on your continent somewhere, and hopefully maybe you could come there and meet some people. I know there's quite a few opportunities available, and they're always looking for the right people.
Yeah, and sometimes these people have the same predicament. They're like, we're looking for people, but we don't know who has that skill set.
Yeah, that's a funny one.
Bringing those people together.
Companies complaining they can't find enough FreeBSD people, and then FreeBSD people, they can't find enough FreeBSD companies.
Yeah, the matchmaking is difficult.
So next up, Mike has a question. He says, hello, Benedict and Alan. I just installed FreeBSD 11 on a Qbox i4 Pro, and when I went to run FreeBSD update, it fails when pulling down the necessary public SSL certs. After doing some research, I see that ARM is not a Tier 1 supported platform, so FreeBSD update will not work. It's a little bit less about the Tier 1-ness than just that compiling, running FreeBSD update for ARM is rather difficult and would take a long time. In particular, especially for embedded device, a lot of ARM devices that use SD cards, FreeBSD update would take a very long time to actually work and would wear out your SD card really badly. So they say, how do I go about updating my system with the current patch level? Am I stuck at P1 until ARM becomes a Tier 1 supported platform? If so, when might that be? So you're not stuck until it becomes a tier 1 platform, but ideally what we'll have is package base relatively soon, which will allow you to install the updates by just overwriting files with bigger files, or with newer files. Yeah, so that one's kind of difficult at the moment.
What about cross-compiling?
Yeah. One other option is obviously to compile the newer patch level on a regular computer, like a AMD 64, and then take it over to the QB board or QBox. But that can work, because obviously compiling it on the QBox is going to take too long. But compiling it on your x86, cross-compiling it on the x86, and then just mounting the user OBJ and user source onto the QBox and doing the make install world and install kernel is definitely one option. I'm also in my enormous amounts of free time working on a script to allow you to update to the latest of the snapshots that Release Engineering puts out like every 2 weeks or so, which isn't quite the same thing as being able to upgrade to 11.0 P5 or whatever the current one is, but would allow you to at least to 11 stable that does have the fixes in it on a somewhat reasonable time period, rather than being stuck on the base.
Yeah,
sadly that's about the best we have.
Yeah, we're working on these and making it better, because there's a lot of demand, especially for ARM64. But that's the most we could do at this point.
And they also say, P.S. I was running Arch Linux on that system before, and the performance of FreeBSD is so much better that I really wish I had switched sooner. So.
See, that's also an incentive to people trying out.
We would really like to get updating to work for you, since you're so happy with FreeBSD.
Okay. The next story is from another Steve in Arkansas. He writes, "Hey guys, welcome Benedict." Thank you, Steve. As a modern Unix hobbyist, I've noticed that although Unix was designed from the ground up using simple tools that would work or that will work well together, these OSs are being experienced by modern newbies as just another Windowsy type system, but with fewer games. It's only the whole free thing that keeps drawing crowds. But the developers and hobbyists down on the CLI know the power of the OS. Will these systems ever be mainstream on desktops when the target users are clearly developers? In other words, will it ever be the year of the BSD desktops? P.S. I'd like to see a show on the earliest history of Unix BSD.
Yeah, I don't know. We've had the year of the BSD console with the PlayStation and so on, and bits of the Switch or whatever. But it's hard to say. Linux is kind of ahead of us on the desktop-y stuff, but.
Although the TrueOS and the IllumOS or the Luminas of this world are going good work. You have to give them that. I mean, they pushed a lot of new
there's a
stuff
difference
on
between
the desktop.
Being having a reasonable desktop environment that developers can use, and that when people get interested in FreeBSD and want to become a developer, that we give them a way to actually be able to successfully run FreeBSD on their desktop in a way that's not so annoying that they switch. It means that they can actually use, and we can grow new developers. At the same time, I don't know that we have the resources to try to, replace OS X or switch the world away from Windows. I don't know that Linux is going to get there very soon either.
It's always getting those people who are not the, the computer science people, or not the super geeks, the people who want to just use their computer to do email and web browsing and all these stuff. These are the people
it depends.
Want to try to.
If all they want is email and web browsing, you can probably do that on BSD very nicely.
Right.
It's when you want a little bit more than that it gets complicated.
Yeah, the additional stuff, like when you start that, and you also want to do, file management and all that gets a little bit more difficult.
It's when you want to play games and so on where it can get more difficult. But yeah, if people's needs are modest enough, then it's easy to get them over to a BSD-based desktop, and especially some lighter Linux users, you could switch their Linux desktop to a BSD desktop and they might not notice. If you gave them the same version of GNOME with the same desktop theme, then they might not notice that they're now running BSD instead of Linux.
Right. The icons in the desktop is basically the same. It's just look and feel, or if once they go down to the file system, they might wonder what's this zpool thing. But other than that, just to use the desktop, it's pretty much the same experience on BSD than on Linux. But yeah, it takes some work and convincing and letting people try it out and see how well it works for them. It's an ongoing challenge that's been going on for years, and I think there will be some progress, and more people will be getting more used to the BSD experience on a desktop.
Yep.
But yeah, it takes some time to get it done.
Yep. So now we have another question from Brad. He says, first of all, I'd like to welcome Benedict to the BSD Now community. He says, well, we will all miss Chris. You and Alan seem to have already developed an on-air rapport. Well, I've known Benedict for quite a while. He was my mentor when I first got into the FreeBSD project. But we've been accused of being
live on conferences.
Yes, we've been accused of being twins before. So we've spent a decent amount of time together, so we know each other decently. Anyway, so Brad says his question is nominally a short one. He says, I'm a sysadmin, and I'm wondering your opinions on configuration management. I'm not a fan of Perl, which rules out CF Engine. I'm even less of a fan of Ruby, which rules out Puppet and Chef. He says, we run Puppet at work, but we're not fond of Puppets changing their best practices every 45 minutes. I will agree with that. We still use Puppet where I work, and we've transitioned over to Puppet 4, but, we're definitely not super happy there, but it is working, which is something.
Yeah, you told me a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So I was also considering switching to Puppet or starting with Puppet, but yeah.
Yeah, it's like starting with Puppet's not bad. It's upgrading every time you switch to Puppet because they change a bunch of things for some reason. I'm hoping that they've gone through enough of that now that they'll do a little bit less of that, but their track record doesn't suggest that, so it's hard to say. So Brad says that leaves the Python-based config management tools like Ansible, SaltStack, and BCFG2. He says BCFG2 has not been updated since 2015, so I'm going to say that was probably not an option. Between Ansible and SaltStack, which do you guys prefer? So I lean a little more towards SaltStack, but I think you're more Ansible?
Yeah, at this point, so I was also evaluating SaltStack for the big data cluster at work together with a student, and we got some interesting results. It has a different model than Ansible. I also noticed some shortcomings in Ansible that I couldn't do that, like, for example, Puppet could do, because I also want to not only deploy stuff from a central management machine to the cluster machine, but also get certain information from different machines back, like a little bit monitoring or what kind of software versions each individual node has. That's interesting for me.
Yeah, so that's
what I'm.
That's one of the reasons we're a little more stuck on Puppet currently. Is we use the exported resources stuff to do things like all of the servers in our cluster learn about each other. Mm-hmm. So each server exports its own. Each server is responsible for making its Nagios configuration, and then the 4 Nagios machines just slurp up that information and write their configs. But also, so we have our system that blocks SSH brute force attacks, but we have exemptions for if the source address is our own servers. So each server adds its own IP address to the configuration of every other server to say, hey, I'm a good guy. And that type of thing. Don't and we even have the point where servers add themselves to DNS when they get created and so on. And I got to spend enough time with Salt yet to see if that'll be easy to replicate or not.
Yeah, it is. They have some nice tutorials. So all these systems make it relatively easy for people to get started. And, the more you use those, the more you can see, I could do this also. And, I could automate that as well, which I've been doing manually for the whole time I've been using it. But it takes some time. But getting into those, I think, is relatively easy because the documentation is there and there are examples you can basically not just literally copy like we've discussed earlier. But you can try those out. Mm-hmm. And I think Ansible has some Linux systems in there that I don't like. So, for example, if you do Ansible setup, which gives you the remote machine information, like what kind of CPU they have, disk space, and all that. This is a little bit more detailed on a Linux system than on a BSD system. That's something that we might need to improve a little bit.
Yeah, so with Puppet,
but in general,
with Puppet, I extended some of the facts to solve that. In a couple of cases, they even had the code, but it was marked as OpenBSD only, and it was like a small change to make it detect this stuff on FreeBSD. But then to commit it to Puppet, they require a contributor agreement and stuff, and it was just enough friction that it wasn't worth my time to do it at that time.
So I'm currently at Ansible, but I'm still looking at other systems just to have a comparison and then see, oh, I was right in the first place, or I'm switching to the other one because I like it so much better. I'm still in the evaluation phase, but at this point, since I give a tutorial about Ansible, I know enough stuff to tell people about it and give some explanations and details that they can start with. But he also writes basically that his experience is with Linux mostly. He has a few FreeBSD boxes, one FreeNAS, one pfSense. All these are supported. All these have hooks and modules that can manage those systems as well. And it's the nice thing, like you write that you also have a laptop running TrueOS. The nice thing is if you encode some of these settings that you always do, like you always set a certain number of sysctls, you always set a certain number of things that you always do, you might want to encode those in a little automation script that you just run at the beginning after you set up your laptop, and then never, like, fire and forget, never think about this again, because the tool does it all for you. And that's where we get started into the whole process. And whether you use Ansible or SaltStack or Puppet or whatever, it's just a matter of your own preference and what works.
Yeah, so he says he's never worked with either Ansible or Salt, but from what he understands, Ansible is easier to deploy and easier to run, but has some limitations, whereas Salt is a bit steeper learning curve, but has more flexibility. That's my understanding as well. You know, we didn't get so far as doing a bake-off between Puppet and Salt. So basically our options were upgrade to the newer version of Puppet or switch to Salt. And we found that they hadn't changed as much. Going from Puppet, I think 3.2 to 3.8 was a much bigger pain than going from 3.8 to 4.9.
Because you had to rewrite
all the manifests. They disabled they changed the way you couldn't do inheritance on nodes anymore. So we had to like explode our config files. And they had once changed from being able to have included files to not. And then it was, okay, having everything in one big file is kind of stupid. So we'll make it so it includes everything in the directory, but in alphabetical order. So then we had to like name subdirectories with numbers, with prefixes to make everything go in the right order. Or just so that we could find stuff, you know, it's like all the manifests are in this directory, or like the node manifests are here, the classes are here, the modules are here. Anyway, we had some unfun, but currently we're still on Puppet because it continues to work, and we haven't had enough pain to make us spend the time to switch to Salt. And we kind of hope that we don't get that much pain because we don't want to have to spend the effort. But eventually we might look at something.
Some other things that I found is once you get more sophisticated, like you want to have a management solution, like you want to have a web page where you can see all these different nodes that you are managing. There are solutions, but most of them, the good ones, are commercial ones, so you have to pay for those. And the ones that are free are not up to snuff with the commercial version. And there are some projects on GitHub, but there's still something to be desired.
So we use Puppet Board, but it suffers from the fact that it's a stereotypical Ruby project. So Puppet Board depends on like PuppetDB. There's this chain of dependencies, and if one version of one of them changes, the other one has to. So eventually there was a newer version of Puppet Board, but it only worked with a newer version of its database interface library, and that database interface library only worked with the newer version of PuppetDB. But we were still on Puppet 3, so we needed the older version. So it meant we couldn't upgrade to the newer version of Puppet Board because we were still using an older version of PuppetDB, because Puppet and PuppetDB certain versions are incompatible. So you have to use a newer Puppet in order to use a newer Puppet DB, or to use a newer Puppet DB, you have to use a newer Puppet. And yeah, the dependency hell there was really making me angry for a while. And in particular, it makes it kind of difficult for the FreeBSD ports tree, because it turns out that when you do upgrade to Puppet 4, you can use Puppet DB 3 or 4, depending on which version. And you need incompatible versions of the dependency for Puppet board for those as well. So in order to support Puppet 3, Puppet 4 early versions, and Puppet 4 late versions, you need 3 different versions of Puppet board and its dependencies and 3 different Puppet DBs. And it gets out of hand very quickly. But if they had the kind of stability where you could just upgrade from Puppet 3.8 to 4.2 to 4.8 without having to change your configuration, it'd be easier to kind of just push the port tree along. But because they're so incompatible, So talking about it makes me want to switch to Salt more. But, as if I don't have enough things to do.
Check it out. Right. Speaking of which, if you are looking at the current FreeBSD journal, which is at freebsdfoundation.org/journal, they have a new issue currently coming out, or that already came out, about config management, covering CF Engine, Puppet, Vagrant, and Salt Stack.
Yes, actually,
so you might want to check that out.
The Puppet article was co-written by my friend Brad Davis and an employee of Scale Engine, Andrew Fengler, who's our sysadmin, who actually did the work for our upgrade from Puppet 3.8 to 4.9. So he's got fresh experience on upgrading, and part of that upgrade was actually building a brand new fresh Puppet 4 install and adding all the bits, because we kept our 3 and our 4 running concurrently, so we just did a completely fresh 4 install. Lots of good stuff in that article of the journal, so definitely check it out.
Okay, so we hope we gave you some pointers and helpful things to look into. And
yeah, that's the end of the show. So if you have any questions, comments, show ideas, topics you want to hear, stories you want to mention, or people you want to interview, or people who want to be interviewed, please email feedback@bsdnow.tv and let us know. And we'll see you back here next week.